In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept across the shattered remnants of the Third Reich, British soldiers encountered something utterly unexpected in the chaos of collapsing Nazi Germany. Thousands of German women in Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, exhausted, terrified, and bracing for the worst. These Helferinnen, communications operators, nurses, clerks, had been told by Goebbels' propaganda machine that capture by the Allies meant torture, rape, and death. Yet, when British troops arrived, something extraordinary happened. Instead of vengeance, the women found kindness. Instead of brutality, they encountered respect. And in that moment, hardened by years of Nazi indoctrination, many of these women broke down and wept, not from fear, but from disbelief. What the British Army did next would not only redefine the treatment of prisoners of war, but would plant the seeds of reconciliation in the ashes of total war. The winter of 1944 marked a turning point in the psychological warfare waged by the Third Reich, not against the enemy, but against its own people. As the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied forces prepared for the final push from the west, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry intensified a campaign of terror designed to ensure that every German soldier and civilian alike would fight to the last breath rather than surrender. In Berlin, in the cavernous halls of the propaganda ministry on Wilhelmplatz, Goebbels himself presided over daily briefings where the message was refined and amplified. Surrender means annihilation. Posters appeared across Germany depicting Allied soldiers as savage beasts. Radio broadcasts described in lurid detail the supposed atrocities committed by British and American troops in occupied territories. Newsreels showed fabricated scenes of brutality. The message was clear and unrelenting. The Allies would show no mercy, especially to women. For the hundreds of thousands of German women serving in auxiliary roles with the Wehrmacht, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signals auxiliaries, Stabshelferinnen, staff assistants, nurses, and administrative personnel, this propaganda took on a particularly sinister dimension. These women, many barely out of their teens, had been recruited to fill non-combat roles as German manpower dwindled. They operated switchboards in command bunkers, decoded messages, tended to wounded soldiers in field hospitals, and maintained the vast bureaucratic apparatus that kept the German war machine functioning. By early 1945, approximately 450,000 German women were serving in these auxiliary capacities across all branches of the Wehrmacht. They wore uniforms, lived under military discipline, and were subject to military law. Yet they were not combatants in the traditional sense, a distinction that would prove crucial in the months to come, though they did not know it yet. In a signals bunker outside Münster in February 1945, 22-year-old Margaret Hoffmann sat at her switchboard, routing communications between Wehrmacht units retreating before the British advance. The daughter of a schoolteacher from Hamburg, she had volunteered in 1943, motivated by a mixture of patriotic duty and the desire to escape the increasingly devastating bombing raids on her home city. Now, as the front lines collapsed, she and her fellow Helferinnen faced an impossible choice: flee westward into the chaos of a disintegrating Germany or remain at their posts and face capture. We had been told repeatedly what would happen if we fell into enemy hands, Margaret would later recall in testimony given to British intelligence officers. Our officers said the British would treat us as combatants and execute us. Others said worse. We would be handed over to their colonial troops who would show no restraint. We were terrified beyond measure. This fear was not irrational paranoia. The Nazi regime had spent years cultivating a doctrine of total war that recognized no distinction between soldier and civilian, combatant and non-combatant. German forces had committed unspeakable atrocities across occupied Europe, and the regime's propaganda machine had convinced many Germans that the Allies would respond in kind. The concept of the Geneva Conventions, international laws governing the treatment of prisoners of war, was either unknown to most German auxiliaries or dismissed as Allied propaganda. In London, however, a very different conversation was taking place. In the wood-paneled offices of the War Office in Whitehall, Senior British military officials and representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross were grappling with a complex legal and moral question. How should German women in military service be treated upon capture? The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established clear protocols for the treatment of male prisoners of war, but it had been drafted in an era when women's participation in military operations was minimal. The convention made no specific provision for women in uniform. This legal ambiguity created both a challenge and an opportunity for British military planners. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, a career officer with the Royal Army Service Corps, who had been assigned to the Directorate of Prisoners of War, argued forcefully in a series of memoranda that Britain had both a legal obligation and a strategic interest in treating German women auxiliaries with scrupulous correctness. "These women are not SS fanatics," he wrote in a January 1945 report. "They are clerks, nurses, and telephonists. Many were conscripted. If we treat them with the same respect we would afford our own ATS, Auxiliary Territorial Service personnel, we will demonstrate the fundamental difference between British values and Nazi barbarism. Moreover, we will encourage further surrenders and potentially gain valuable intelligence." Hartley's arguments were not universally accepted. Some officers, particularly those who had witnessed the devastation of the Blitz or lost comrades in brutal fighting, questioned whether German military personnel, regardless of gender, deserved such consideration. The debate reflected a broader tension within British society between the desire for retribution and the commitment to upholding civilized standards even in the midst of total war. The matter was ultimately resolved at the highest levels. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, briefed on the issue, was characteristically blunt. "We do not make war on women. We shall treat them as prisoners with all the protections that status entails. Britain will not descend to the level of our enemies." His directive was unambiguous. German women in military service were to be treated as prisoners of war, entitled to the full protections of the Geneva Convention, regardless of the legal technicalities. This decision was communicated down through the chain of command in a series of orders issued in February and March 1945. Field commanders were instructed to ensure that all ranks understood the policy. Special provisions were made for the establishment of separate detention facilities for women prisoners, staffed where possible by members of the British ATS or the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, YIF. Medical care, food rations, and accommodation were to meet the same standards as those provided to male POWs, but orders issued in Whitehall were one thing. Implementation on the chaotic battlefields of a collapsing Germany was quite another. As British forces advanced into the Rhineland and beyond, they would encounter thousands of German women in circumstances that tested both their discipline and their humanity. The true measure of Britain's commitment to its principles would be determined not in the comfortable offices of Whitehall, but in the mud and rubble of a dying Reich. In early March 1945, as the British Second Army prepared to cross the Rhine, intelligence reports indicated that Wehrmacht units in the path of the advance included significant numbers of women auxiliaries. Briefings were held at battalion and company level, emphasizing the importance of correct conduct. "You will treat these women as you would wish your own sisters to be treated if the situation were reversed," one company commander told his men. "We are British soldiers, not barbarians." Yet even as these preparations were made, the German women themselves remained trapped in a nightmare of propaganda and fear. In bunkers, field hospitals, and administrative centers across Western Germany, they listened to the approaching thunder of British artillery and prepared for the worst. Many wrote farewell letters to their families. Some obtained cyanide capsules, determined to take their own lives rather than face capture. Others simply waited, paralyzed by terror, for the moment when British soldiers would burst through the doors. What happened next would shatter their expectations and, for many, their entire understanding of the world. The first major encounter between British forces and German women auxiliaries in significant numbers occurred on March 24, 1945, during Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine. As the British Second Army established bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the river, advance units of the 6th Airborne Division captured a Wehrmacht communications center in the town of Hammenkellen, approximately 5 kilometers inland from the Rhine. The facility, housed in a requisitioned textile factory, was a critical node in the German military communications network. Inside, 37 Nachrichtenhelferinnen had remained at their posts, maintaining telephone and radio links for retreating German units. When British paratroopers from the 5th Parachute Brigade stormed the building at dawn, they expected resistance. What they found instead were terrified young women, some still wearing their headsets, frozen at their switchboards. Captain Michael Thornton, commanding a company of the 7th Parachute Battalion, was the first British officer to enter the main operations room. A veteran of Normandy and the Ardennes, Thornton had seen the worst of the war. Yet the scene that confronted him that morning would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his life. The room was in semi-darkness, lit only by the glow of equipment panels, Thornton later recorded in his after-action report. As we entered with torches and weapons raised, I saw perhaps 20 women at their stations. Not one moved. They simply stared at us with expressions of absolute terror. One girl, she couldn't have been more than 19, was trembling so violently that her headset fell off. Another had her hands clasped in prayer. Several were weeping silently. It was immediately clear that they expected to be shot where they sat. Thornton, a school teacher from Kent in civilian life, made a decision that would set the tone for thousands of similar encounters in the weeks to come. He lowered his weapon, removed his helmet, and addressed the women in his limited German, "Keine Angst, wir tun Ihnen nichts." Don't be afraid, we won't hurt you. The effect was not immediate. Years of propaganda could not be erased by a few words. But Thornton's next actions spoke louder than any reassurance. He ordered his men to secure the building, but to keep their weapons lowered. He asked if any of the women spoke English. A young woman named Erika Schneider, a former English teacher from Dusseldorf, hesitantly raised her hand. Through Erika, Thornton explained that the women were now prisoners of war, that they would be treated in accordance with international law, and that they would not be harmed. He asked if any were injured or required medical attention. He requested that they gather their personal belongings and prepare to be evacuated to a secure location where they would be processed. I could see they didn't believe me, Thornton recalled. They had been told we were monsters, and here I was asking politely if they needed a doctor. It was surreal. But I knew that our actions in the next few hours would determine whether they cooperated or whether we faced a situation that could turn ugly. What happened next was a testament to the discipline and humanity of the British soldiers involved. As the women were escorted from the building, paratroopers offered them water from their canteens, cigarettes, and even chocolate from their rations. Small gestures, but profoundly significant to women who had been conditioned to expect brutality. When one elderly Helferin, a 53-year-old widow named Frau Becker, who had been conscripted to work in the facility's kitchen, stumbled on the debris-strewn stairs, a young private from Manchester caught her arm and steadied her, addressing her respectfully as ma'am. The women were taken to a temporary holding area in a church hall in the nearby village of Ringenberg, which had been cleared of civilians. There, they encountered members of the British ATS who had been assigned to assist with the processing of women prisoners. The presence of British women in uniform had a profound psychological impact. These were not the savage colonial troops of Nazi propaganda, but professional military women who treated their German counterparts with firm but respectful efficiency. Sergeant Dorothy Winters of the ATS, a former nurse from Birmingham, was among the first to interact with the German women. They were in a dreadful state, she later wrote in her diary, exhausted, filthy, and absolutely convinced they were about to be executed or worse. We gave them tea, proper British tea, and biscuits. We showed them where they could wash. We explained, through interpreters, that they would be safe, that they would be fed, that they would be allowed to write to their families. And slowly, very slowly, they began to understand that we meant what we said. It was during this initial processing that the first emotional breakthrough occurred. A young Helferin named Anna Richter, 21 years old, from a small village in Westphalia, suddenly broke down in tears. Through her sobs, she repeated over and over in German. Sie behandeln uns wie Menschen. Sie behandeln uns wie Menschen. They treat us like humans. They treat us like humans. Sergeant Winters, though she did not speak German, understood the emotion, if not the exact words. She put her arm around Anna's shoulders and let her cry. Within minutes, other German women were weeping as well, not from fear, but from relief, from exhaustion, and from the overwhelming realization that they had been lied to, that the enemy they had been taught to fear was showing them more humanity than their own regime ever had. This scene at Ringenberg was replicated across the British advance in the following weeks. As the Second Army pushed deeper into Germany, capturing town after town, they encountered German women auxiliaries in field hospitals, administrative centers, supply depots, and communications facilities. In each case, British commanders implemented the protocols established by the War Office: secure the prisoners, ensure their safety, provide immediate medical care if needed, and process them through proper POW channels. But the implementation of these protocols was not without challenges. The sheer scale of the collapse of German resistance meant that British forces were often overwhelmed by the number of prisoners, both male and female, requiring processing. Resources were stretched thin, accommodation was scarce, and not all British soldiers, particularly those who had suffered losses or witnessed German atrocities, were initially sympathetic to the plight of German prisoners, regardless of gender. In early April, near the town of Celle, a company of the Royal Scots captured a Wehrmacht field hospital that included 23 German nurses and medical auxiliaries. The hospital was in chaos, filled with wounded German soldiers and civilian casualties from Allied bombing. The senior British medical officer, Major Robert Sinclair, a surgeon from Edinburgh, faced an immediate dilemma. His own medical resources were limited, and he had British casualties requiring treatment. Yet the Geneva Convention was clear. Medical personnel, even enemy medical personnel, were to be protected and, where possible, allowed to continue their humanitarian work. Major Sinclair made a decision that exemplified the British approach. He placed the German nurses under the supervision of British medical staff, but allowed them to continue caring for the wounded, both German and, in some cases, British soldiers who had been captured earlier and were being treated in the same facility. He ensured they received the same rations as British medical personnel and were accommodated in secure but decent quarters. One of the German nurses, Sister Helga Zimmermann, a 34-year-old veteran who had served on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, was initially suspicious of this arrangement. She had witnessed the brutal treatment of Soviet prisoners by German forces and expected reciprocal treatment. Instead, she found herself working alongside British nurses, sharing medical supplies, and discussing patient care in a mixture of broken English and German. I could not reconcile what I was experiencing with what I had been told, Sister Zimmermann later testified. These British doctors and nurses treated us as colleagues, not as enemies. When we ran short of morphine for a German soldier in agony, a British medical officer provided it without hesitation. When I asked why, he simply said, "Because he is in pain, and we are doctors." It was a profound moment for me. Yet not all encounters were so straightforward. In mid-April, near the town of Jelsen, a platoon of the Durham Light Infantry captured a group of 12 German women who had been serving with a Luftwaffe signals unit. Among them was a young woman named Greta Hoffmann, who wore the insignia of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth. Greta was a committed Nazi, indoctrinated from childhood, and she refused to cooperate with her captors. She spat at British soldiers, shouted Nazi slogans, and attempted to incite the other women to resist. The platoon commander, Lieutenant Thomas Ashford, a 25-year-old from Durham, faced a difficult situation. He could not allow Greta's behavior to undermine discipline or endanger his men, yet he was bound by orders to treat all women prisoners with respect. His solution was to isolate Greta from the other prisoners, assign a female ATS sergeant to supervise her, and ensure she received the same treatment as the others, despite her hostility. Over the course of several days, as Greta was processed through the POW system, her defiance gradually eroded. She was given clean clothing, adequate food, and medical attention for a minor injury. She was allowed to write a letter to her mother. She was treated, in short, with a level of decency that contradicted everything she had been taught about the enemy. When she was finally transferred to a permanent POW camp, she was no longer shouting slogans. She was silent, thoughtful, and visibly shaken. These individual encounters, multiplied across hundreds of locations, created a cumulative effect that went far beyond the immediate military situation. Word spread among German military personnel, both male and female, that surrender to the British was not the death sentence Nazi propaganda had promised. This had a direct impact on German morale and willingness to continue fighting. Intelligence reports from April 1945 noted a marked increase in German surrenders, particularly among auxiliary personnel, in sectors facing British forces compared to those facing Soviet forces, where the propaganda about Allied brutality had, in the case of the Red Army, some basis in reality. By mid-April, British forces had captured and were processing over 8,000 German women auxiliaries. The logistical challenge was immense, but the commitment to proper treatment remained unwavering. Temporary camps were established, staffed by ATS and WAF personnel. Medical facilities were set up. Food supplies, though limited by the general scarcity in Germany, were distributed equitably. And crucially, the women were protected from the chaos and violence that characterized the final collapse of the Third Reich. But the true test of British resolve was yet to come, as the full horror of Nazi crimes was revealed, and the question of justice versus vengeance took on new urgency. As British forces advanced deeper into the heart of Germany in April 1945, they began to uncover the full extent of Nazi atrocities. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on April 15th by the British 11th Armored Division confronted soldiers with scenes of horror beyond imagination, tens of thousands of emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses, and evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. The discovery sent shockwaves through the British Army and back to Britain itself. For the German women prisoners in British custody, the liberation of the camps created a profound crisis. Many had been genuinely unaware of the full extent of the Holocaust and the concentration camp system. Others had known, but had not comprehended the scale. Now, as British authorities began to document the crimes and, in some cases, forced local German civilians, including some women prisoners, to witness the evidence, the psychological impact was devastating. But the revelations also created a crisis for British military authorities. Among the ranks, there was growing anger and a desire for retribution. Soldiers who had treated German prisoners with scrupulous correctness now questioned whether such restraint was appropriate in the face of such monstrous crimes. The question arose, should German women who had served the Nazi regime, even in non-combat roles, be held accountable? And if so, how could justice be balanced with a commitment to humane treatment? In Berlin, or rather in the temporary British military headquarters established in recently captured Lüneburg, senior officers grappled with these questions. Brigadier Hugh Llewellyn Hughes, the senior medical officer who had been among the first to enter Bergen-Belsen and who was now overseeing medical care for the survivors, was particularly vocal. "We have a moral obligation to the victims," he argued in a heated meeting with the Provost Marshal. "But we also have a legal obligation to uphold the rule of law. We cannot become what we fought against." The German High Command, or what remained of it, was equally perplexed by British conduct. Intelligence intercepts and interrogations of captured German officers revealed a consistent pattern of disbelief and confusion. The Germans had expected the British to respond to the discovery of the camps with immediate reprisals against German prisoners. Instead, British authorities maintained their commitment to the Geneva Convention, even as they began the process of identifying and prosecuting war criminals. One particularly revealing interrogation took place in late April at a POW facility near Münster. Oberst Colonel Friedrich Weber, a Wehrmacht signals officer who had been captured along with his staff, including several women auxiliaries, was questioned by British intelligence officers about German military communications, and also about his knowledge of the camps. Weber, a career officer from an old Prussian military family, was contemptuous of the Nazi regime, but had served it nonetheless. "I do not understand you British," Weber stated, according to the interrogation transcript. "You have discovered the camps, you have seen what was done, yet you continue to treat us, even the women who served the regime, with this correctness. In your position we would have shot every prisoner. This is not weakness, is it? It is something else, something we never understood about you." The interrogating officer, Major Peter Caldwell of the Intelligence Corps, a barrister from London in civilian life, responded, "It is called the rule of law, Colonel. It is what separates civilization from barbarism. We will prosecute those responsible for crimes, but we will not punish the innocent, and we will not descend to the level of our enemies." Weber's response was telling. "Then you have already won a victory we can never achieve. You have kept your souls." This exchange, recorded in the archives of the Judge Advocate General's office, encapsulates the profound psychological and moral dimension of the British approach to German women prisoners. By maintaining standards of humane treatment, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of enemy atrocities, British forces were making a statement about their own values, a statement that resonated far beyond the immediate military context. But the German women prisoners themselves were experiencing their own reckoning. As news of the camp spread through the POW facilities, many were forced to confront the reality of the regime they had served. Some refused to believe the reports, dismissing them as Allied propaganda. Others were genuinely shocked, having been kept ignorant by the regime's compartmentalization of information. Still others had suspected, but had not wanted to know. In a women's POW camp established in a former German military barracks near Paderborn, British authorities organized a screening of documentary footage from Bergen-Belsen for the German prisoners. The decision was controversial. Some argued it was cruel, others that it was necessary. The screening was not mandatory, but most of the women attended. Sergeant Dorothy Winters, who was present, recorded the scene in her diary. The room was silent except for the projector and the narrator's voice. As the images appeared on the screen, the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the piles of bodies, I watched the faces of the German women. Some wept, some turned away, some sat in stunned silence. One young woman, I think her name was Liesel, vomited and had to be helped outside. Afterwards, no one spoke. What could be said? In the days following the screening, the atmosphere in the camp changed. The German women became more withdrawn, more compliant, but also more thoughtful. Some requested to speak with British officers or chaplains, seeking to understand, to explain, or simply to confess their shame. Others wrote letters, not to their families, but to the British authorities, expressing their horror at what had been done in their nation's name. One such letter, preserved in the National Archives, was written by Margaret Hoffman, the signals operator from Münster, who had been captured in February. Addressed to Captain Thornton, who had been the first British officer she encountered, it read in part, "I do not know if you will remember me. I was one of the women you captured at Hammenkeln. You told us we would not be harmed, and you kept your word. I did not believe you then. I thought it was a trick. But you have treated us with more kindness than we deserved. Now I have seen what was done in the camps. I did not know. I swear I did not know, but I should have known. I should have asked. I am ashamed to be German. I am ashamed that I served that regime. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I only want you to know that your kindness has shown me what we lost when we followed Hitler. You have shown me what it means to be human." Captain Thornton, when he received the letter weeks later, was moved, but also troubled. "I didn't know what to say to her," he later reflected. "Part of me wanted to be angry, to say that her ignorance was no excuse. But another part of me recognized that she was just a young woman who had been caught up in something monstrous, and I realized that by treating her with decency, we had given her the chance to see that, to understand it. That was worth something." The German High Command's confusion about British conduct was not limited to the treatment of prisoners. As the war entered its final weeks, German military intelligence, what remained of it, struggled to understand British strategic intentions. Reports from the front indicated that British forces were not engaging in the wholesale destruction of German infrastructure that might have been expected. Bridges were captured intact when possible, rather than destroyed. Civilian populations in occupied areas were provided with food and medical care. And crucially, German women prisoners were being treated in a manner that contradicted every assumption of Nazi ideology. In a remarkable document discovered after the war in the archives of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, the German High Command, an intelligence assessment dated April 28, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, attempted to analyze British conduct. The assessment, written by an unknown intelligence officer, noted the British continue to adhere to international law regarding prisoners, including women auxiliaries, despite their discovery of the camps. This conduct is incomprehensible from a National Socialist perspective, but consistent with Anglo-Saxon legalistic traditions. It has had a significant impact on morale among our forces facing the British, with increased surrenders reported. More significantly, it has undermined the propaganda ministry's narrative about Allied intentions. Recommendation: none. The war is lost. The British have demonstrated that their system, which we despised as weak, has proven more resilient than our own. This assessment, clinical and detached, nevertheless reveals the profound cognitive dissonance experienced by German military leaders. They had built an entire ideology on the premise that liberal democracy was weak, that adherence to law and humanitarian principles was a fatal flaw. Yet, in the crucible of total war, it was the British system, with its commitment to the rule of law even in the treatment of enemies, that had proven stronger. For the German women prisoners, this realization came more slowly and more personally. In the POW camps, they were witnessing a functioning system of military justice and administration that treated them as individuals with rights, not as mere units to be processed. They received regular meals, medical care, and were allowed to correspond with their families once postal services were restored. They were organized into work details, but the work was reasonable, and they were paid a small wage in camp currency. They were, in short, being treated exactly as the Geneva Convention prescribed. This treatment stood in stark contrast to their experiences under the Nazi regime, where even German citizens had been subject to arbitrary authority, where the law was whatever the party said it was, and where human dignity was contingent on racial and political criteria. The contrast was not lost on the more perceptive among them. Sister Helga Zimmermann, the nurse who had been allowed to continue her medical work under British supervision, reflected on this in a letter to her sister written in May 1945. "I have spent the last month working alongside British medical staff. They are professional, competent, and they treat their patients, including German patients, with the same care they give their own. They have shown me more respect as a medical professional than I ever received from our own officers, who saw us nurses as little more than servants. I am beginning to understand that we were not fighting for Germany. We were fighting for a regime that despised everything that makes us human. The British have shown me what we could have been." As Germany surrendered and the war in Europe ended, the question shifted from how to treat German women prisoners to what would become of them in the peace that followed. The final collapse of Nazi Germany in early May 1945 created unprecedented chaos. As the Wehrmacht disintegrated and the Nazi state apparatus ceased to function, millions of displaced persons, refugees, former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, and prisoners of war flooded across a devastated landscape. For British military authorities, the challenge of maintaining order and providing humanitarian assistance was immense. It was in this crucible of chaos that the British commitment to humane treatment of German women prisoners faced its severest test. Resources were stretched to breaking point. British forces were simultaneously trying to secure territory, disarm German military units, provide aid to liberated concentration camp survivors, manage millions of refugees, and maintain their own supply lines. In this context, the continued adherence to proper treatment of German POWs, particularly women who were not seen as a security threat, might have been seen as a luxury Britain could not afford. Yet the opposite occurred. As the scale of the humanitarian crisis became apparent, British authorities actually expanded their efforts to ensure that German women prisoners were properly cared for. This decision was driven partly by practical considerations. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to cause problems and more likely to cooperate, but also by a fundamental commitment to principle that had been reinforced, not weakened, by the discovery of Nazi atrocities. In mid-May 1945, a critical situation developed at a temporary POW facility near Hanover. The facility, established in a former German military barracks, housed approximately 200 German women auxiliaries awaiting processing and repatriation. The camp was under the command of Major Elizabeth Thornton, no relation to Captain Michael Thornton, of the ATS, a pre-war social worker from Manchester who had been commissioned in 1940. The crisis began when a severe outbreak of typhus was detected among the prisoners. Typhus, spread by lice in the unsanitary conditions that prevailed across Germany in the spring of 1945, was a deadly threat. The disease had killed thousands in the concentration camps, and British medical authorities were acutely aware of the danger of an epidemic. Major Thornton faced an impossible choice. The safest course would be to quarantine the entire facility, isolate the infected prisoners, and wait for the outbreak to burn itself out, a process that would inevitably result in significant deaths among the German women. The alternative was to commit scarce British medical resources, including precious supplies of DDT delousing powder and antibiotics, to treat enemy prisoners at a time when British forces and liberated Allied prisoners also required medical care. Major Thornton did not hesitate. He immediately requested emergency medical assistance from the British Second Army's medical services. Within 24 hours, a medical team led by Captain James Morrison, a physician from Edinburgh, arrived with supplies and equipment. The entire camp was placed under medical quarantine. Every prisoner was deloused, examined, and treated. Infected prisoners were isolated in a makeshift hospital ward. The barracks were fumigated and cleaned. The operation was a logistical and medical triumph. Within 2 weeks, the outbreak was contained. Of the 43 women who had contracted typhus, only 2 died, a mortality rate far lower than would have been expected without treatment. The German women, who had initially been terrified that the quarantine was a prelude to their extermination, echoing Nazi methods, instead witnessed a massive effort to save their lives. One of the survivors, a young woman named Frieda Bauer, who had been seriously ill, later wrote, "I was delirious with fever. I remember British nurses, our enemies, sitting with me through the night, cooling my forehead, giving me water, speaking softly to me in English words I did not understand, but whose meaning was clear. They were trying to save my life. When I recovered and realized what they had done, I could not stop crying, not from sadness, but from shame and gratitude." The Hanover incident was not unique. Across the British occupation zone, similar crises emerged and were met with similar responses. In Schleswig-Holstein, British forces established a network of transit camps for German women prisoners awaiting repatriation. These camps, while basic, provided shelter, food, and medical care. In Hamburg, British military authorities requisitioned buildings to house women prisoners and employed German civilians to assist in their care, paying them with military scrip. But the most significant challenge came not from disease or logistics, but from the psychological trauma experienced by many of the German women prisoners. Years of Nazi indoctrination, followed by the shock of defeat, the revelation of the Holocaust, and the collapse of their entire world, had left many in a state of profound psychological distress. Some were suicidal. Others were catatonic. Still others clung desperately to Nazi ideology as the only framework they had for understanding their world. British military authorities, recognizing the problem, took an unprecedented step. They established counseling services for German women prisoners. These services, staffed by British military chaplains, ATS welfare officers, and, where possible, German medical professionals who had been vetted and cleared of Nazi affiliations, provided psychological support and attempted to help the women process their experiences. Chaplain Robert Hughes, a Methodist minister from Wales who served with the British Army's Chaplains Department, was assigned to work with German women prisoners in the summer of 1945. His diary entries from this period provide a remarkable window into the psychological state of the women and the British response. June 3, 1945. Met with a group of German women today. Most are young, early 20s. They are lost, confused, and deeply traumatized. One girl, Anna, told me she doesn't know who she is anymore. Everything she believed was a lie. Her country is destroyed. Her family is scattered. She asks me, "What is the point of living?" I have no easy answers. I can only listen and try to show her that there is still kindness in the world, that there is still hope. It is the hardest work I have ever done. June 15, 1945. Progress is slow but real. Some of the women are beginning to open up, to talk about their experiences, their fears, their guilt. They are starting to see that they were victims too, not in the same way as those in the camps, but victims nonetheless of a monstrous ideology that destroyed their humanity. I try to help them understand that they can choose who they will be going forward, that their past does not have to define their future. Some are receptive, others are not ready. I pray for patience. This psychological and spiritual work was controversial. Some British soldiers and officers questioned why resources were being devoted to helping German women cope with their trauma, when British personnel and liberated Allied prisoners also needed support. The answer, articulated by senior chaplains and medical officers, was that Britain's commitment to humane treatment was not contingent on reciprocity or convenience. It was a matter of principle. Moreover, there was a pragmatic dimension. British authorities were already thinking about the post-war reconstruction of Germany. A population of traumatized, embittered former prisoners would be a source of instability and potential resistance. By contrast, former prisoners who had been treated with decency and who had been helped to process their experiences might become advocates for reconciliation and democratic values in the new Germany. This forward-thinking approach was exemplified in the establishment of educational programs in the POW camps. Beginning in June 1945, British authorities organized classes and lectures for German women prisoners on topics ranging from basic literacy — some of the younger women had had their education interrupted by the war — to British history, democratic governance, and international law. The goal was not indoctrination, but rather exposure to ideas and perspectives that had been suppressed under Nazi rule. These programs were voluntary, but participation was high. Many of the women, having had their eyes opened to the lies they had been told, were hungry for knowledge and understanding. The classes were taught by British personnel, often ATS officers with teaching backgrounds, and by German civilians who had been cleared by denazification screening. One particularly successful program was a series of discussions on the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law, led by Major Peter Caldwell, the barrister and intelligence officer who had interrogated Colonel Weber. Major Caldwell explained the legal framework that governed the treatment of prisoners of war, the history of these laws, and why Britain adhered to them even when the enemy did not. I wanted them to understand that the way they had been treated was not an accident or a matter of British sentimentality, Major Caldwell later explained. It was the result of a legal and moral framework that Britain and other civilized nations had built over decades. I wanted them to see that law, properly applied, protects everyone, including former enemies, and I wanted them to take that understanding back to Germany with them. The impact of these programs was difficult to quantify, but anecdotal evidence suggested they were effective. German women who participated often expressed surprise and interest in concepts like the rule of law, individual rights, and democratic accountability, ideas that had been alien to Nazi ideology. Some began to see a connection between the humane treatment they had received and the political and legal systems that underpinned British society. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, the process of repatriating German women prisoners began in earnest. British authorities had established protocols for screening prisoners to identify any who might have been involved in war crimes or who posed a security risk. The vast majority of women auxiliaries having served in non-combat roles were cleared for release. The repatriation process itself was conducted with the same attention to proper procedure that had characterized their treatment throughout. Women were provided with documentation, given a final medical examination, issued with basic supplies for their journey, and transported to their home regions or to designated assembly points where they could be reunited with their families. For many of the women, the moment of release was bittersweet. They were returning to a Germany that had been utterly transformed, divided, occupied, devastated. Many had lost family members. Their homes had been destroyed. The future was uncertain. Yet they were also carrying with them an experience that had profoundly changed their understanding of the world. Margaret Hoffman, the signals operator whose letter to Captain Thornton had so moved him, was among those repatriated in September 1945. As she prepared to leave the camp, she sought out Major Elizabeth Thornton, who had been transferred to the facility after the typhus crisis, to express her gratitude. "I told her that I had come into British custody expecting death, and instead I had been shown humanity," Margaret later recalled. "I told her that I would never forget what the British had done for us, and that I would spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the mercy I had been shown." Major Thornton simply smiled and said, "Then we have both done our duty." It was very British, very understated, but it meant everything to me. As the women returned to civilian life in a shattered Germany, the question remained, what would be the lasting impact of their experience in British custody? The winter of 1945-1946 was one of the harshest in European history. Across a devastated Germany, millions struggled to survive amid the ruins. Food was scarce, fuel was almost non-existent, and the infrastructure of normal life had collapsed. In this desperate environment, the experiences of German women who had been prisoners of the British took on unexpected significance. In towns and villages across the British occupation zone, former women auxiliaries returned to find their communities shattered. Yet they also brought with them something unexpected, stories of how they had been treated by their captors. These stories, shared in hushed conversations in ruined homes, in queues for rations, and in the makeshift shelters that housed the displaced, began to reshape German perceptions of the British occupiers. In Hamburg, a city that had been devastated by Allied bombing, Margaret Hoffman returned to find her family's home destroyed and her mother living in a cellar with neighbors. As Margaret shared her experiences of British captivity, the respect she had been shown, the medical care, the education programs, her mother wept. "I thought I had lost you," her mother said. "The radio told us that prisoners were being killed, that the British were as bad as the Russians. But you are alive, and you tell me they treated you well. I do not understand this war anymore." Margaret's story was not unique. Across the British zone, similar conversations were taking place. The cumulative effect was significant. While the Soviet occupation zone in eastern Germany was characterized by widespread violence, including mass sexual assault of German women, the British zone, while far from perfect, was marked by a relative adherence to law and order. The contrast was stark, and it was noticed. British military government authorities, responsible for administering the occupation zone, began to receive reports of a phenomenon they had not anticipated. Former German women prisoners were actively cooperating with British authorities, volunteering information, and in some cases serving as intermediaries between the occupiers and the occupied population. This cooperation was not universal. Many Germans remained hostile or resentful, but it was significant enough to be noted in official reports. One such report, filed in January 1946 by the British military government's Civil Affairs Branch, noted, "Former women POWs have proven to be valuable assets in establishing communication with the German civilian population. Their positive experiences in British custody have made them more receptive to British administration and more willing to assist in reconstruction efforts. This represents an unexpected dividend from the policy of correct treatment of prisoners." The unexpected dividend manifested in various ways. In Hanover, Frieda Bauer, the young woman who had survived typhus thanks to British medical care, volunteered to work as a translator for the British military government. Her knowledge of English was limited, but her willingness to help was genuine. She became a trusted liaison, helping to resolve disputes between British authorities and German civilians, and advocating for fair treatment of her fellow Germans. "I felt I owed the British a debt," Frida later explained. "They had saved my life when they had no obligation to do so. The least I could do was help them understand my people, and help my people understand that the British were not the monsters we had been told they were." In Schleswig-Holstein, a group of former women auxiliaries established an informal support network for other women who had been prisoners. They shared information about repatriation procedures, helped women locate missing family members, and provided emotional support. They also served as advocates, bringing cases of genuine hardship to the attention of British authorities and often receiving assistance. This network came to the attention of Major Elizabeth Thornton, who had been assigned to the British military government's welfare section. Recognizing the potential, she worked with the women to formalize the network into an official organization, the Women's Assistance League, which received modest funding and support from British authorities. The League became a model for civil society organization in the British zone and played a role in the eventual reconstruction of German democratic institutions. But the impact of the British treatment of German women prisoners extended beyond the practical and into the realm of the psychological and moral. For many of the women, their experience in British custody had been a profound education in values they had never encountered under Nazi rule: the rule of law, individual dignity, and the possibility of reconciliation even after terrible conflict. Sister Helga Zimmermann, the nurse who had worked alongside British medical staff, returned to her profession in post-war Germany. She became an advocate for medical ethics and for the humane treatment of all patients, regardless of nationality or background. In a speech given in 1948 at a conference on post-war medical practice in Hamburg, she reflected on her experiences. "During the war, I served a regime that viewed human beings as expendable resources, to be used and discarded according to ideological criteria. In British captivity, I encountered a different philosophy, that every human being has inherent dignity and rights, regardless of who they are or what they have done. This was not just rhetoric. I saw it practiced every day. British doctors and nurses treated German patients with the same care they gave their own. This experience transformed my understanding of what it means to be a medical professional. It is a lesson I carry with me every day." The German High Command, or rather the former officers who had survived the war and were now themselves prisoners or had been released, also grappled with the implications of British conduct. In the years following the war, as many of these officers wrote memoirs or were interviewed by historians, a common theme emerged: incomprehension mixed with grudging respect. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, who had been imprisoned by the Nazis themselves in 1944 after the failed plot against Hitler and was later liberated by American forces, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The British treatment of prisoners, including women auxiliaries, was correct to a fault. This was not weakness, as we had been taught to believe, but a different kind of strength, the strength of a society confident in its values. We Germans had prided ourselves on our military prowess, but we had lost sight of the moral foundations that make a society worth defending. The British never forgot those foundations, even in the midst of total war. That is why they won, and why we deserve to lose." This recognition, while not universal among former German military personnel, represented a significant shift in thinking. The Nazi ideology had taught that humanitarian concerns were a weakness, that law was merely a tool of power, and that the strong had the right to dominate the weak. The British treatment of German prisoners, particularly the vulnerable population of women auxiliaries, had demonstrated the opposite, that adherence to law and humanitarian principles was a source of strength, not weakness. The impact was also felt at the highest levels of British policy. In London, as the government grappled with the challenges of post-war reconstruction and the emerging Cold War, the success of the humane treatment policy was noted. In a cabinet memorandum dated March 1946, Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin wrote, "Our treatment of German prisoners, particularly women, has yielded significant benefits in terms of cooperation and goodwill in our occupation zone. This stands in stark contrast to the situation in the Soviet zone. As we consider our long-term policy towards Germany, we should recognize that our adherence to civilized standards has been not only morally right, but strategically advantageous." This recognition influenced British policy in the crucial years of 1946-1949 as the division of Germany solidified and the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was established. The British commitment to democratic values and the rule of law in their occupation zone helped to create the conditions for the successful establishment of a democratic German state, a state that would become a crucial ally in the Cold War and, eventually, a leading member of the European community. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the individual women themselves. In the decades following the war, many of the former auxiliaries who had been British prisoners became advocates for reconciliation between Britain and Germany. They joined Anglo-German friendship societies, hosted British visitors, and shared their stories with younger generations. In 1965, on the 20th anniversary of VE Day, a group of former German women prisoners organized a reunion in Hamburg. They invited British veterans who had been involved in their capture and detention. Among those who attended was Captain Michael Thornton, now a retired school teacher, and Sergeant Dorothy Winters, who had remained in the ATS after the war and had risen to the rank of major before retiring. The reunion was an emotional event. German women who had once been terrified prisoners embraced British veterans who had once been their captors. They shared memories, compared photographs, and reflected on the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. The local Hamburg newspaper covered the event, and the story was picked up by British media. In an interview given at the reunion, Margaret Hoffman, now a middle-aged woman with children of her own, said, "20 years ago, I was convinced that British soldiers would kill me. Instead, they showed me what it means to be human. They gave me back my life, and in doing so, they gave me hope for the future. Today, I am proud to call many of them my friends. This is the true victory over Nazism, not just the military defeat, but the triumph of humanity over hatred." Captain Thornton, in his own interview, was characteristically modest. "We simply did our duty as we understood it. We treated them as we would have wanted our own women to be treated. It was the right thing to do, and I'm glad it made a difference. But the real credit goes to these women, who had the courage to reject the lies they had been told and to embrace a better way." The story of the British treatment of German women prisoners had become a symbol of reconciliation and the possibility of redemption even after the darkest of conflicts. As the decades passed and the Second World War receded into history, the story of how British forces treated German women prisoners became a subject of academic study, military analysis, and moral reflection. What had seemed at the time to be simply a matter of following orders and adhering to international law was increasingly recognized as something more significant, a demonstration of how adherence to civilized values, even in the midst of total war, could have profound and lasting consequences. In military academies across the democratic world, the British treatment of German women POWs became a case study in the strategic value of humane conduct. At the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where British Army officers are trained, lectures on the laws of armed conflict routinely reference the 1945 policy as an example of how proper treatment of prisoners can yield intelligence, reduce enemy resistance, and facilitate post-conflict reconciliation. A 1975 study by the British Army's historical branch, titled Prisoners of War, Policy and Practice in the British Army, 1939-1945, devoted an entire chapter to the treatment of German women auxiliaries. The study concluded, "The decision to treat German women in military service as prisoners of war entitled to full Geneva Convention protections, despite legal ambiguities, was vindicated by events. The policy contributed to increased German surrenders in the final months of the war, facilitated intelligence gathering, and created a foundation for post-war cooperation in the British occupation zone. Moreover, it upheld British military honor and demonstrated the superiority of democratic values over totalitarian ideology. But the legacy extended far beyond military doctrine. In Germany itself, the story became part of the complex process of coming to terms with the Nazi past. For many Germans, particularly those who had lived through the war, the contrast between Nazi brutality and Allied, particularly British, adherence to law and humanitarian principles was a powerful lesson in the consequences of abandoning civilized values. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of VE Day, the German magazine Der Spiegel published a lengthy feature article titled Die Gefangenen, die weinten, the prisoners who wept. The article, based on interviews with surviving former women prisoners and British veterans, explored the psychological and moral dimensions of the British treatment policy. The article concluded, "In treating their enemies with humanity, the British demonstrated what Germany had lost under the Nazis, the understanding that law and morality are not weaknesses to be exploited, but foundations of a civilized society." The tears of German women prisoners in 1945 were not just tears of relief, but tears of recognition that they had been on the wrong side of history. The article sparked a national conversation in Germany about memory, responsibility, and reconciliation. It was particularly influential among younger Germans who had not lived through the war, but were grappling with their country's history. The story of the British treatment of German women prisoners became a counterpoint to the narrative of German victimhood that some sought to promote. It demonstrated that even in defeat, Germans had been treated with a humanity that their own regime had systematically denied to others. In Britain, the story took on a different significance. In a post-war era marked by the loss of empire, economic challenges, and questions about national identity, the treatment of German women prisoners became a source of quiet pride, an example of British values upheld under the most difficult circumstances. It was invoked in debates about military ethics, immigration policy, and Britain's role in the world. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, the Imperial War Museum in London opened an exhibition titled Prisoners of War, The British Experience, 1939-1945. The exhibition included a section on German prisoners in British custody, with particular attention to the treatment of women auxiliaries. Visitors could view photographs, documents, and personal testimonies from both British personnel and former German prisoners. Among the exhibits was a letter from Margaret Hoffman to Captain Thornton, donated by Thornton's family after his death in 1989. The letter, written in 1945 and displayed alongside Thornton's service record, became one of the most viewed items in the exhibition. Museum visitors reading Margaret's words about being treated like humans often paused in reflection. For many, it was a powerful reminder of the importance of maintaining moral standards even in the midst of conflict. The exhibition also featured video interviews with surviving participants. One of the most moving was an interview with Frida Bauer, now in her 70s, who had survived typhus thanks to British medical care. Speaking in fluent English, which she had learned after the war, Frida reflected on her experiences. "When I was ill with typhus, I was certain I would die. I had seen what happened in the camps. The Nazis simply let people die, but the British did not. They used their precious medicines to save me, an enemy. Why? Because they believed that every life has value. That simple belief, acted upon, changed my life. It showed me that there is an alternative to hatred and cruelty. It gave me hope that humanity could survive even the worst of wars. I have spent my life trying to live up to the example they set." The academic community also took note. Historians, political scientists, and ethicists examined the British treatment of German women prisoners as a case study in various contexts. Some focused on the legal dimensions, exploring how the British interpretation of the Geneva Convention influenced subsequent developments in international humanitarian law. Others examined the psychological impact, both on the prisoners and on the British personnel involved. Still others analyzed the strategic and political consequences. One particularly influential work was a 2005 book by British historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell titled Humanity in War: The British Treatment of German Women Prisoners, 1945. Based on extensive archival research and interviews with survivors, the book argued that the British policy represented a crucial moment in the evolution of humanitarian norms. Dr. Mitchell wrote, "The British decision to treat German women auxiliaries as prisoners of war, entitled to full protections, was not inevitable. There were legal ambiguities, resource constraints, and strong emotions that could have justified a different approach. But British military and political leaders chose to adhere to the highest standards of conduct, even when it was difficult and even when the enemy had not reciprocated. This choice had profound consequences. It demonstrated that humanitarian law is not just a set of rules to be followed when convenient, but a fundamental commitment that defines civilized societies. It showed that even in total war, there are lines that must not be crossed, and it proved that adherence to these principles is not a weakness, but a source of moral and strategic strength." The book was widely praised and became required reading in many university courses on military ethics and international relations. It also sparked renewed interest in the personal stories of the women involved, leading to additional research and publications. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of VE Day, a remarkable event took place in London. The British government, in cooperation with the German government, organized a ceremony of remembrance and reconciliation at Westminster Abbey. Among those invited were surviving former German women prisoners who had been in British custody and surviving British veterans who had been involved in their detention. Only a handful of participants from 1945 were still alive, but those who attended were treated with honor. Margaret Hoffman, now 92 years old, traveled from Hamburg with her daughter and grandchildren. She was greeted by the British Defense Secretary and escorted to a place of honor in the Abbey. During the ceremony, which was attended by dignitaries from both nations and covered by international media, Margaret was invited to speak. Standing at the lectern, frail but clear-voiced, she addressed the assembled crowd. 70 years ago, I was a frightened young woman who believed that capture by British forces meant death. Instead, I found humanity. I found respect. I found hope. The British soldiers who captured me and the British personnel who cared for me in the months that followed showed me that even in the darkest times, human decency can prevail. They gave me back my life, and they gave me a reason to believe in the possibility of a better world. Today, as I stand in this sacred place, I want to say thank you. Thank you to Britain for showing mercy when you had every reason not to. Thank you for demonstrating that the values of law, justice, and human dignity are not just words, but principles worth upholding even at great cost. And thank you for helping to build a Europe where former enemies can stand together as friends. This is your legacy, and it is a legacy of which you should be immensely proud. The ceremony was broadcast across Europe and was widely praised as a powerful symbol of reconciliation. In the days that followed, newspapers and television programs in both Britain and Germany featured stories about the treatment of German women prisoners, bringing the history to a new generation. The legacy of the British treatment of German women prisoners in 1945 extends into the present day. It continues to inform discussions about military ethics, the laws of war, and the treatment of prisoners in contemporary conflicts. It serves as a reminder that how we treat our enemies, even in the midst of war, defines who we are as societies. In military training programs, the story is used to illustrate the principle that adherence to the laws of armed conflict is not just a legal obligation, but a strategic and moral imperative. In diplomatic circles, it is invoked as an example of how respect for human rights can facilitate post-conflict reconciliation, and in classrooms across Europe, it is taught as a lesson in the importance of maintaining civilized values even in the face of barbarism. Perhaps most importantly, the story serves as a testament to the power of individual choices. Every British soldier who offered water to a frightened German prisoner, every ATS officer who treated a former enemy with respect, every medical officer who used scarce resources to save enemy lives. Each of these individuals, through their actions, upheld a standard of conduct that had profound consequences. They demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, humanity can prevail. As Dr. Mitchell concluded in her book, the British treatment of German women prisoners in 1945 was not a grand strategy or a carefully calculated policy designed to achieve specific outcomes. It was, at its core, a commitment to doing the right thing, because it was the right thing, regardless of the circumstances. That this commitment yielded strategic benefits, facilitated reconciliation, and contributed to the post-war order was, in many ways, secondary. The primary achievement was moral. Britain maintained its soul even in the darkest hour. That is a legacy worth remembering and worth emulating. Today, in museums, archives, and memorials across Britain and Germany, the story of the German women prisoners who wept not from fear but from relief continues to be told. It is a story of humanity in the midst of inhumanity, of law upheld in the face of lawlessness, and of the possibility of redemption even after the most terrible of conflicts. It is ultimately a story about what it means to be civilized and why that matters, even and especially in war. If you found this remarkable tale of British humanity and moral courage during the darkest days of the Second World War as moving as we did, we'd be tremendously grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. There are countless untold stories from the war, moments of compassion, acts of extraordinary courage, and decisions that shape the world we live in today, and we're committed to bringing them to light. What other aspects of the British experience in World War II would you like us to explore? Perhaps the unsung heroes of the home front, the secret operations that turned the tide of war, or the remarkable stories of reconciliation in the war's aftermath? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your suggestions help guide our research. And if you know someone who would appreciate this story, a history enthusiast, a veteran, or simply someone who believes in the power of human decency, even in the worst of times, please do share this video with them. These stories matter, and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.